I am Bob, and I'm here to tell you a story about Nathan taking a ride. Actually, he's taken several rides. Um, this happened quite a few years ago, uh, maybe about 240 years ago. Nathan Stacy uh, lived in Massachusetts. His parents had originally lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where the first Universalist church in America was founded. Uh, they were members of that congregation. Uh, it turned out that Mr. Stacy was a fisherman and lost his license, so he had to move someplace else. He moved to New Salem, Massachusetts. They didn't have a Universalist church there. I should point out that back in those days, there were two separate religions, Universalism and Unitarianism. The Universalists believed that God was loving of all and would punish none. So it was a, a religion that was frowned upon by many. When they moved to New Salem, Massachusetts, years later, there was no Universalist church, and the trip back to Gloucester to go to that church would have taken them about 14 hours with a horse and buggy. So they decided not to bother with that because they'd have to leave about 8 o'clock in the evening to get there in time for church at 10 o'clock the next morning, and then they'd have to drive back. And that didn't appeal to them a whole bunch. I'm not sure it would appeal to anybody here these days. And actually, I was thinking that if we had the same means of transportation today, it would not make much sense if the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua were not here to drive a horse and buggy up to First Unitarian or First Universalist Church in Rochester, because that would take about 4 hours, and it would be kind of hard to manage to get the family together to make that trip, I kind of think. When the Stacy family moved to New Salem, Massachusetts, they had no chance to go to a Universalist church, so they went to another church. And it was not until Nathan Stacy was about 12 years old that circuit riding preachers passed through the town of New Salem and reintroduced Nathan to Universalism. He happened to run into a preacher who was rather famous in the day, very maligned, but very famous, and an awfully good preacher who took Nathan under his wing and made him think strongly about becoming a preacher. Nathan wasn't sure about that. He tried his hands at several things, including blacksmithing and school teaching and store clerking. None of those worked out too well for him, so he decided to become a preacher. Funny story is that the guy who was mentoring him, teaching him, suddenly developed a headache just before the Sunday service, and told Nathan that he was going to have to do the preaching. And this was Nathan's first attempt at preaching, and he wasn't too sure about it. But he went ahead and did it, and his teacher told him that there wasn't too much problem with the headache anymore. Nathan decided eventually to become a preacher, but it was not like today. He didn't have a set church to go to. The churches in those days were sometimes held in buildings, church buildings, but more often they were in houses, farmsteads, barns, um, and sometimes out in the open, preaching from a tree stump. Um, it meant that Nathan had to ride a horse um, during the daytime to get to his preaching assignments, which could have been any one of 24 places in New York, Pennsylvania. And it meant that he stayed on the road throughout the week, getting home only sometimes. More often than not, he slept on a blanket on the ground in the woods. Sometimes he was offered a place to stay in the town where he preached. Sometimes they paid him, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes he had enough money to feed either himself or the horse, and he chose to feed the horse. Riding a horse seems like a lot of fun, unless you have to do it every day, out in the cold or the rain, blazing sun. He didn't get any school vacations off. He just had to keep working. Nathan was about 5 feet tall, weighed 100 pounds. Your parents can demonstrate to you how big that is, I suppose. After each service, people to whom he preached would pass a hat around to collect money. Sometimes people put money in it, sometimes they didn't. He occasionally had to flesh out his earnings by teaching school as a substitute teacher, and you know how much fun that would be. Nathan lived to be 90 years old and was eventually, for the last 50 years or so of his life, was able to maintain a pulpit in a couple of churches, one in Michigan and one in Pennsylvania. So he didn't have to ride all of his life, but he was a founder of at least 24 societies in New York State, some of which are still active. He did preach in the Finger Lakes. I was unable to find out exactly where, but in those days long ago, Unitarian Universalism lived like Nathaniel did, just to spread their religion. We're very lucky they did, because here we are.